On a frozen January night in 1948, the United States came closer to World War III than most Americans will ever know. There were no missiles launched, no declarations, no famous speeches. There was only a single dot on a radar screen, one American B-29 Superfortress, that drifted off course and crossed an invisible line in the Pacific sky. That line happened to be the border of the Soviet Union. Within minutes, Soviet fighters were in the air. Within minutes after that, Washington lost contact with the bomber. For a terrifying moment, American commanders believed the crew had been shot down by MiGs, and that this was the opening shot of a nuclear war. But almost nobody outside the military ever heard what truly happened. Not the public, not the press, not even most members of Congress. This is the real story, long buried in classified archives, of how a single American bomber nearly triggered the first nuclear war in human history. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe, because the more you listen, the more of these forgotten Cold War stories you help bring back to life. The story begins hours earlier, before anyone knew how dangerous this routine patrol would become. It was January 29th, 1948. The Korean Peninsula was still quiet. China had not yet fallen to communism. The Berlin airlift hadn't begun. But beneath the surface, the Cold War had already started to heat up. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were watching each other with suspicion, hunger, and fear. Each side believed the other might strike first. That night, a U.S. Air Force B-29 took off from Yokota Air Base in Japan for what was supposed to be a simple weather reconnaissance mission, one of hundreds flown that month. The crew was experienced, a pilot who had flown combat over Japan, a navigator familiar with Pacific winds, and a radio operator trained to keep a steady link back to command. They expected turbulence, maybe ice, certainly boredom. They did not expect Soviet fighters. The aircraft climbed to cruising altitude and turned northeast toward the Kuril Islands, the long chain of volcanic landmasses stretching between Japan and Russia. The weather was rough, blinding snow, shifting winds, and sheets of freezing mist that crawled over the bomber's windows. Inside, the crew relied on instruments more than sight, and that was the beginning of the problem. Unknown to them, a minor navigation error was growing. Pacific winds can be brutal, especially in winter, and the jet stream that night was stronger than predicted. Minute by minute, mile by mile, the B-29 drifted off its planned course. At first a dozen miles, then dozens more. In 1948, there was almost no margin for error. The border between international airspace and "we just invaded the Soviet Union" was razor thin. The navigator, First Lieutenant Harold Whitcomb, kept recalculating. But the storms disrupted both celestial navigation and radio beacons. The bomber flew blind, and the Soviets noticed. At a radar station on Idarup Island, one of the most heavily fortified Soviet bases in the Kurils, operators detected something unusual, a large aircraft approaching from the south. Too big to be a Soviet patrol plane, too slow to be a jet, and coming from a direction no Soviet aircraft should come from. They sounded the alert. Within minutes, two Soviet La-11 fighters scrambled into the sky. These interceptors were fast, armed, and orders during this period were brutally simple. Any unidentified aircraft crossing into Soviet airspace was to be challenged, and if it did not turn back immediately, it was to be destroyed. Meanwhile, on board the B-29, the first warning came not from radar, but from the radio operator, Staff Sergeant Milton George. He caught a faint Soviet transmission on an emergency frequency, something he had never heard on previous patrols. He tapped the pilot on the shoulder and said quietly, "Sir, I think someone's calling us, and I don't think they're friendly." The pilot looked out into the darkness. Nothing, just snow and the distant glow of the moon. Then the interphone crackled with tension as Whitcomb, the navigator, said, "We're off course. We're too far north. Maybe way too far." The pilot's stomach tightened. How far? A long silence. Then, far enough that we might be in Soviet territory. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The engines hummed. The bomber vibrated in the storm. Every man on board knew what that meant. The B-29 wasn't just any bomber. It was the bomber that dropped the atomic bombs on Japan. In 1948, the Soviets believed every American B-29 might be nuclear armed. If Soviet fighters found them, they would assume the worst. The pilot pushed the controls, banking the aircraft south, hoping to escape into the storm. But they were already being tracked. The Soviet fighters were climbing fast.
Back at Yokota Air Base, the duty officer scribbled a note into the logbook. B-29 7245 changed course due to weather. Possible comms loss. Monitoring. Less than 10 minutes later, another note. Unable to establish contact. Radar track unstable. Less than 5 minutes after that, aircraft disappeared from scope. To the Americans, it looked like the plane had been shot down. And halfway across the world, in the Kremlin, Soviet commanders were preparing a statement in case the United States accused them of starting a war. The stage was set, and the world was seconds away from a disaster neither side intended. While the Americans tried desperately to re-establish contact, the B-29 crew finally saw what they had feared most. Out of the swirling snow, two dark shapes emerged, sleek, fast, glinting in the broken moonlight. Soviet fighters. The pilot, Captain Robert McCall, whispered, "Jesus, they found us." The Soviet Law 11s closed distance with alarming speed. Their wings flashed navigation lights as they formed up on either side of the bomber, one slightly above, one slightly behind. Textbook interception positioning. The American crew could see the red stars painted on the fuselage. No one mistook their intentions. Sergeant George, gripping his radio headset, tried hailing the fighters on the international distress frequency. "Unidentified aircraft, this is United States Air Force Flight 7245. We are off course due to weather. We request permission to exit your airspace." Silence. The fighters held formation. Then one abruptly dipped its wing, signaling for the B-29 to descend and follow. The bomber crew had seconds to decide. If they obeyed, they would be forced to land on a Soviet base. That meant internment, interrogation, and a political crisis that could erupt into war. If they refused, the Soviets might assume the Americans were carrying nuclear weapons and preparing a surprise attack. Captain McCall made a choice he hoped wouldn't kill them. He held course. The Soviet fighters immediately reacted. One slid ahead of the bomber, crossing dangerously close to the nose, forcing McCall to bank sharply. The other climbed above the B-29 and then dropped back down into position, warning maneuvers. Sergeant George shouted over the interphone, "They're telling us to land, sir. They won't let this go." The pilot breathed through his teeth. "We're not landing in the USSR. Hold on." The Soviet fighters flashed their landing lights again, more aggressively this time. Then, without warning, one of them fired a short burst of tracer rounds across the B-29's nose, deliberately missing by only a few meters. That message was universal. Next time, we won't miss. Inside the bomber, panic rose like steam. Men grabbed onto whatever they could. The flight engineer cursed under his breath. The navigator prayed softly. The gun crews, though outmatched, swiveled turrets into defensive positions, but the pilot ordered them not to fire. "No one touches the guns," McCall barked. "If we fire, it's war." Instead, he made a desperate move. He cut power to 2 engines. The bomber sagged instantly, dropping altitude faster than expected. Snow blasted across the windscreen. For a moment, the Soviet fighters overshot, their formation disrupted. They looped around to reacquire the target, but that handful of seconds gave the Americans a sliver of hope. The B-29 plunged into thicker cloud cover, turbulence shaking the aircraft violently. Ice formed along the wings, instruments flickered, and the altimeter spun erratically. McCall fought to keep control. The navigator yelled, "Course south-southeast, head for open water." Behind them, the Soviets fired another burst, this time into the clouds where the bomber had been seconds earlier. They were trying to herd the Americans downward, but the storm hid the B-29 long enough for McCall to push the engines back to max power. Whether by luck or design, The Soviet pilots lost visual contact. But the danger wasn't over. The B-29 was still deep inside Soviet airspace, and ground-based anti-aircraft units were already tracking it. The bomber's radar warning receiver crackled, multiple stations locking on. If the Soviets believed the Americans were running, they might open fire. The radio operator tried contacting anyone, American bases, Japanese signal stations, even civilian maritime frequencies. Nothing. The storm drowned out almost everything. Then faintly, a voice broke through the static. 20 miles, repeat 20 miles off planned route. Advise immediate correction. It was Yokota. They heard him. The crew erupted with relief, but the message wasn't good news. The bomber was far deeper into Soviet territory than any of them realized. Worse, Yokota could only hear them on one frequency out of 6. They were still nearly blind. The navigator recalculated. If we keep this heading, we can reach open water in 20 minutes. If we drift even a little, we'll hit more bases. The pilot tightened his grip on the controls. Gentlemen, stay sharp. This isn't over. Far behind them, the Soviet fighters struggled to reacquire the bomber. Radar contact was intermittent due to the storm, and every minute the Americans stayed in cloud cover bought them precious distance. On the ground, Soviet commanders debated what to do. The unidentified aircraft had ignored landing instructions, broken radio silence, and taken evasive action. Some officers argued they should shoot it down. Others feared shooting down a B-29 might trigger a war they weren't ready for. In Moscow, a telegram was drafted, but not yet sent. Possible American violation of borders, awaiting confirmation. In Washington, a different message was being prepared. If Soviet forces have attacked our aircraft, we will respond. 1 bomber, 10 men, 2 superpowers balanced on a knife's edge. The B-29 crew had no idea how close they were to igniting the world. As they broke free of the worst clouds, the navigator called out, "We're approaching the coastline. Open water ahead." But then, the radio operator stiffened. "Sir, new Soviet transmissions. I think they scrambled more fighters." The pilot swallowed. "Then we outrun them." The B-29 dropped lower, dangerously low, flying just above the waves to avoid radar detection. Spray hit the underside of the fuselage. The engine strained at maximum output. Crewmen watched the gauges, praying nothing overheated. Minute by minute, the coastline disappeared behind them. And finally, after a brutal half-hour of flight, Yokota Air Base came through, loud and clear. B-29 7245, radar contact re-established. You are over international waters. Proceed to base, emergency priority. On board the bomber, men slumped in their seats, exhausted, shaking, half frozen from fear. They had escaped. Or so they thought. Because when they landed at Yokota, they were met not with relief, but with armed military police, flashing lights, and top-secret orders. What happened next was buried in classified files for decades. When the wheels of the B-29 finally touched the runway at Yokota, the crew expected cheers, medics, maybe even a debrief with intelligence officers. Instead, they saw something that made their stomachs sink. Armed military police surrounded the aircraft. Jeeps blocked the taxiway. Floodlights snapped on. Armed guards motioned the pilot to stop before the bomber even reached parking position. As soon as the engine slowed to idle, soldiers climbed the ladder and boarded the aircraft with weapons drawn, not as enemies, but as if handling something dangerously sensitive. "Crew remains seated," one officer ordered. "No one leaves until instructed." The men exchanged uneasy glances. They had nearly been shot down. They had flown blind through storms. They had escaped Soviet fighters. Why the sudden hostility? But then they saw the patch on the lead officer's sleeve. Strategic Air Command. This wasn't routine. The crew was escorted off the plane one by one and taken into separate rooms inside the base intelligence building. Each man was questioned for hours. Did you transmit anything unusual? Were you intercepted? Were you forced to descend? Did you see weapons? Did they fire on you? But the strangest question came last. Did you lose anything? The crew insisted they hadn't. The bomber was intact, no bombs missing, no equipment gone, nothing jettisoned. But the interrogators weren't convinced. They had already received reports that Soviet interceptors had filed a claim. An American bomber had opened its bomb bay doors while inside Soviet airspace. A gesture that could mean only one thing in 1948: preparing to drop a nuclear weapon. Captain McCall slammed his fist on the table when he heard the accusation.
Meanwhile, the Soviets scrambled additional fighters from Kamchatka and Sakhalin, searching the skies for a second bomber that didn't exist. They feared the intruding aircraft was a forward scout for a nuclear strike, standard U.S. doctrine during the late 40s. The tension rose by the minute. Back in the interrogation rooms, the navigator, Lieutenant Whitcomb, was confronted with a map labeled with red grease pencil marks outlining the bomber's exact flight path, based on Soviet radar logs. The Americans had obtained these logs through classified listening posts in Okinawa. The line told the story plainly. The B-29 had flown directly over one of the Soviet Union's most sensitive military zones, Kuril naval installations, used for early warning patrols. Whitcomb stared at the map. "We were that deep in?" The officer nodded. "If they'd shot you down, it would have been justified by their rules of engagement." The navigator sank back in his chair, covering his face. "God, I could have started a war." The interrogations continued until dawn. Then suddenly, everything changed. A colonel from SAC entered the room and told the men, "You will speak to no one about the events of this flight, not your families, not the press, not other pilots. This mission never happened." The official report would list the flight as a routine weather deviation. No mention of Soviet fighters, no mention of radar locks, no mention of bursts fired across the nose of the bomber. As far as the Air Force was concerned, the story was buried. But history has a way of revealing itself. Because at the same time the Americans were trying to hush the event, something unexpected happened on the Soviet side. The intercepted radio transmissions of their fighter pilots were recorded and translated by American intelligence. Those translations, long kept classified, painted a terrifying picture. One Soviet pilot was heard saying, "The American bomber is not responding, it continues north. Orders?" Ground control replied, "Force landing. If it refuses, destroy." That meant the fighters were fully authorized to shoot. Another pilot described the bomber, "Large aircraft, 4 engines, matches description of American atomic carrier." A chilling phrase. And then the line that made American analysts go cold. "We expected more planes. Where are the others?" The Soviets thought the single B-29 was part of a formation that might be preparing a nuclear strike. That misunderstanding could have triggered a retaliation. And all of this came from one lost bomber blown off course by winter winds. After the interrogations ended, the crew was quietly flown back to the United States, reassigned to other units, and instructed never to mention the incident again. The B-29 itself was inspected, stripped of sensitive equipment, and sent for maintenance without explanation. For decades, the event remained hidden behind black ink and redacted pages. Only recently, through declassified CIA intercepts, Soviet archives, and Air Force transcripts, did the full picture emerge. And what it revealed was alarming. The world had been within minutes of nuclear escalation at a time when neither side had the protocols to prevent an accidental war. And yet, the story didn't end there. Because months later, a second incident occurred, even stranger than the first. And this time, the Americans weren't the ones who crossed the border. The Soviets were. Months after the lost B-29 nearly triggered a nuclear response, American intelligence stations from Alaska to Japan began noticing something unsettling. This time, it wasn't a U.S. aircraft drifting towards the Soviet Union. It was Soviet aircraft drifting towards the United States. On a frigid night in early 1949, operators at an air defense radar site near Nome, Alaska, detected a large target approaching from the west, slowly, steadily, and directly along a route used by Soviet long-range bombers. The duty officer stared at the green radar screen. "We've got a bogey. Big one." Within minutes, Air Defense Command scrambled 2 F-80 Shooting Stars to intercept. As the jets climbed through icy cloud layers, the radar track crossed an invisible line in the sky, the U.S. Air Defense Identification Zone. The unidentified aircraft had entered American airspace. For a few tense minutes, it looked like the roles had reversed. When the American jets finally caught up, they spotted a huge silver aircraft struggling against headwinds, a Soviet T-4. The sight made every pilot's blood run cold. The T-4 wasn't just any bomber, it was a reverse-engineered copy of the American B-29. Down to the rivet patterns, fuel systems, and even cabin layout, the Soviets had replicated the aircraft so precisely that American airmen jokingly said the communists had copied the cigarette burns on the pilot's seats. But no one was laughing now. The bomber was less than 60 miles from mainland Alaska. The F-80s pulled alongside, wagging wings in an international signal to turn back. The bomber didn't respond. It kept flying. One American pilot later testified, "The T-4 crew looked terrified. They weren't attacking, they were lost, and they knew exactly how dangerous that was." Their situation mirrored what the American B-29 crew had faced months earlier: bad weather, bad instruments, and a deadly border where a single wrong turn could start a war. But this time, something even stranger happened. The Soviet bomber cut its engines. It began to glide. The Americans panicked. A powerless bomber? Was it crashing? Was this a ploy? Was it carrying a nuclear device they intended to detonate in the air? Air Defense Command barked orders. Stay with it. Do not let it disappear. The T-4 glided lower, losing altitude fast. At 5,000 feet, the pilots restarted the engines. Smoke belched from the nacelles. The aircraft stabilized, but barely. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bomber turned, slowly, painfully, like a wounded animal limping back to Siberia. The Americans let it go. The incident was logged, sealed, and then forgotten, until the B-29 case reopened months later. Analysts noticed something chilling. Both events shared the same pattern. Both happened during severe winter storms. Both involved aircraft drifting hundreds of miles off course. Both involved potential nuclear delivery platforms entering enemy airspace. And no one, not the U.S., not the Soviets, had any reliable way to prevent misunderstandings. A senior Pentagon analyst wrote in a restricted memo, "If an accidental border crossing can appear identical to a deliberate nuclear strike, the world is running blind." That memo was suppressed. Meanwhile, Air Force commanders demanded answers. Why were long-range aircraft from both sides getting lost so easily? The truth was more embarrassing than anyone expected. Neither nation, despite all its bravado, actually had mature long-range navigation systems in the late 1940s. The Americans relied on celestial navigation, radio beacons, and early Doppler radar. The Soviets relied on similar techniques and, often, stolen copies of American equipment. Both sides were flying aircraft thousands of miles with tools that barely worked in winter storms. The risk wasn't ideological hostility. The risk was technology that hadn't caught up to strategy. In classified hearings, multiple B-29 navigators admitted they had no training for Arctic storms. Soviet archives later revealed that their bomber crews had even less training. Some navigators were using outdated charts from the 1930s. The Pentagon quietly issued new protocols. The Kremlin did the same. But the fear remained. What if next time the aircraft didn't turn back? What if a nervous pilot misread an order? What if a radar operator mistook a storm-blown bomber for the first wave of a nuclear attack? And then, another incident. This time would push both nations to the brink and alter nuclear policy forever. In late 1949, American listening posts detected a new kind of Soviet transmission. Detonation confirmed, yield matches expected values. The Soviets had tested their first atomic bomb. The monopoly was over. The entire strategic balance changed overnight. And the lost B-29 case, once seen as a bizarre navigational error, suddenly looked like something far more dangerous. The first unintentional nuclear confrontation of the Cold War. It made Washington realize something that should have been obvious. If a single lost bomber could be mistaken for a nuclear strike while only one side had atomic weapons, what would happen now that both sides had them? Years later, at an Air Force symposium, one retired officer finally spoke openly about the incident. He said, "We didn't just dodge a bullet, we dodged World War III before World War III had even a name."